Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, great to be back.
This time we're going to be digging into The Economist from November 30th.
Lots to talk about, always is.
Always is, yeah. So we've got a grab bag as usual, geopolitics, economics, tech trends.
Even a bit of consumer behavior in there.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. So let's jump right in. First up, trade wars.
Oh boy.
Reloaded. It seems like the U.S. is maybe
Gearing up.
gearing up for another round of tariffs. And this time, it's not just China, it's Mexico and Canada too.
Well, you said it right. Trade wars reloaded. We've seen this before, right? From the U.S., at least, with the Trump administration imposing tariffs back in 2018. And now it looks like they're considering slapping some tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from both Mexico and Canada.
Okay, so we've seen this movie before, but what's the sequel going to look like? What are the potential economic ripples from all of this?
Well, The Economist lays it out pretty clearly. The impact could be significant.
Wow.
For example, I don't know if you knew this, but more than half of pickup trucks sold in the U.S. are actually made in Mexico.
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, so if these tariffs go through, you could see prices for those trucks spike. And then on top of that, we could see some companies shifting manufacturing to Asia as a way to sort of sidestep the whole thing.
So higher prices for consumers, potential job losses in both Mexico and Canada, and maybe companies moving production to Asia.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it really raises this bigger question, right? Are we seeing this global resurgence of protectionist policies? Like, if the U.S. is turning inward, how do other countries react? Could we see this domino effect of retaliatory tariffs and trade barriers popping up everywhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. All right, let's move on to a completely different kind of conflict. The war in Ukraine.
Still raging on.
Yeah, sadly.
Yeah.
The Economist has this piece that proposes a potential framework for peace. But it all hinges on this idea of creating credible security guarantees for Ukraine to deter future Russian aggression, which to me sounds incredibly difficult to pull off.
Yeah. You're not wrong. It's a very complicated situation. So NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table for now. So the question becomes, how do you create a neutral Ukraine that can actually defend itself against a much larger and more powerful neighbor? Like, who's going to provide those security guarantees? Would it be a coalition of European countries, the U.S.? And the big question is, would Russia even honor any agreement?
Yeah, it's like you're trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. And then there's this huge moral dilemma too, right?
Yeah.
How do you balance this desire for peace with the need to hold Russia accountable for the invasion and, all the suffering that it's caused?
Oh, absolutely. It's this constant balancing act. On one hand, you have the urgent need to stop the bloodshed, prevent further destruction.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have to have justice. You have to deter future aggression. And any peace agreement would have to grapple with both.
Yeah, so much to think about there. Okay, deep divers. Ready for a hard left turn. From geopolitics and war to batteries.
Battery.
Yeah, batteries. The Economist dives into this high-profile collapse of Northvolt, which was a Swedish battery startup, and they use this as a case study to kind of examine the role of government intervention in emerging tech sectors.
Interesting. It's a bit of a head-scratcher too, right? I mean, Northvolt seemed to have it all. Government backing billions in investments. They were operating in this booming market for electric vehicle batteries, but they still went belly up.
So what happened? Was it just bad management, or are there some broader lessons to be learned from this whole debacle?
Well, The Economist points to a few things that contributed to their downfall, like their expansion plans were super ambitious, maybe too ambitious. They also seem to underestimate the competition from Chinese battery manufacturers. And then there's the question of government intervention.
Okay, so government intervention is supposed to help nurture these new industries,
Yeah.
but it sounds like it might have actually created some problems for Northvolt.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance, right? Government support can be helpful, but it can also lead to complacency and sort of distort market forces. It's like trying to grow a plant in a greenhouse. You can protect it from the elements, but if you keep it in there too long, it's not going to be able to survive in the real world.
It makes you wonder if governments can actually pick winners in these fast-moving sectors like green tech.
Right. Is this a cautionary tale for other countries that are hoping to kind of build up their own green tech industries?
Okay, let's hop across the pond now to the UK, where the political scene is always interesting.
Always.
This time, The Economist is talking about this new populist party called Reform UK. They're gaining some ground, attracting voters who are disillusioned with the traditional parties. So what's behind this surge in support for them?
It seems like Reform UK is tapping into this deep well of discontent among voters who feel like they've been left behind by the political establishment. They're worried about immigration, economic inequality, and they feel like the traditional parties just aren't listening to their concerns.
And it's interesting because they only have one seat in parliament, but they seem to be having this outsized impact on the political discourse.
Yeah, their influence can be seen in how they're shaping the debates on these key issues. They're forcing the other parties to actually address these concerns, and it's shifting the political landscape, even if they haven't really translated that influence into electoral success yet.
Yeah, it reminds me of how the Tea Party movement in the U.S. really shook things up back in the early 2010s, even though they didn't win a ton of elections themselves.
It's a good comparison. Both of these movements represent a backlash against the political establishment and show how these outsider movements can disrupt the status quo.
Okay, let's stay in the realm of political upheaval, but head back to the U.S. for this one. The Economist has this article about a growing movement to split Chicago from the rest of Illinois.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, but it's actually gaining some traction.
Yeah.
So what's the deal here? Why do people want to break up Illinois?
Well, it highlights this deep urban-rural divide that we see in many parts of the U.S. You have Chicago, which is this incredibly diverse and vibrant city, and it feels increasingly disconnected from the more rural conservative parts of the state. And these divisions are playing out in everything from taxes to social issues to just basic cultural values.
And it's not just Illinois, right?
Yeah.
We see these divisions playing out on national level, but this situation really shows how they can exist within a single state, too.
Exactly. And it raises questions about governance and representation. Can a state with such divergent interests effectively govern itself, or do these divisions make it impossible to find any common ground?
And it makes you wonder, is this a fringe idea that'll eventually fade away? Or is this a sign of things to come in other places that are deeply divided?
It's a trend worth watching. If these divisions continue to deepen, we could see similar movements popping up in other states where urban and rural areas just have completely different priorities.
All right, let's travel south now to Uruguay, a country that's often seen as this beacon of stability and progressive politics in Latin America. But The Economist points out that even beacons face challenges, and Uruguay's new leftist president is dealing with some tough economic realities.
Yeah, he's trying to balance these really ambitious goals with some serious economic headwinds. Like you've got rising inflation, persistent poverty, and limited government resources.
But on one hand, he wants to expand social programs and reduce inequality. But on the other hand, he's got to keep the economy growing and prevent things from spiraling out of control.
It's a tough spot, and what makes Uruguay so interesting is that it's often held up as this model for other countries in the region. They've achieved a level of social and economic progress that a lot of their neighbors haven't. But can they keep it going in the face of all these challenges?
It's a high-stakes experiment for sure.
Right.
If they can make it work, it could embolden other leftist movements in the region. But if things go south,
It could have the opposite effect and make other countries hesitant to pursue these ambitious social programs.
all right, let's zoom back to the Middle East, where we have this unexpected ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. And The Economist has this really interesting take on it. They say that this could be an opportunity for former President Trump to step in as a peacemaker.
You know, it sounds strange, but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. He does have experience in the region. He brokered the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and a number of Arab countries. And reportedly, he's developed this close relationship with a Lebanese-American businessman who could act as a back channel to Hezbollah.
Okay, hold on. A back channel to Hezbollah. It sounds like something out of a spy movie. But what would Trump's motivation be here? Is he really interested in peace, or is this just another way to stay in the spotlight?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Oh.
Some people think he sees this as a chance to boost his foreign policy credentials and maybe even position himself for another presidential run. Others say he's genuinely committed to peace in the region.
And how would the current administration react to all of this?
It's hard to say. They might welcome his involvement, especially if he's able to make some progress, but they might also be worried about his motives and concerned about him potentially disrupting their own diplomatic efforts.
It would definitely add another layer of complexity to an already messy situation. Okay, let's end this segment with a quick rundown of some tech trends. The Economist highlights a few interesting developments in the world of consumer tech. And first up, audiobooks are booming.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's listening to audiobooks these days.
I know, I've definitely jumped on the bandwagon myself. It's just so convenient. But what's driving this surge in popularity?
I think it's a few things. The rise of subscription services like Audible has made it super easy and affordable to access tons of audiobooks.
It's like Netflix, but for books.
Exactly. And a lot of these services have features that make listening even easier, like variable playback speeds, sleep timers, and you can switch between devices without any hassle.
Plus, our lives are just so busy these days. It's hard to find time to sit down with a book. But with audiobooks, you can listen while you're doing other things, like commuting, exercising, even doing chores.
It's the perfect solution for our multitasking lifestyles. And it's also making literature more accessible to people who maybe don't have the time or inclination to read a physical book.
Okay, but does something get lost when we move from the printed page to the digital voice?
hmm
Like, is the experience of reading diminished?
It's a good question. Some people argue that, yeah, you do miss out on some of the nuances of the author's writing when you listen to a book instead of reading it.
Yeah, like I love holding a physical book, turning the pages, underlining passages that really resonate with me.
I get that. But some people say that audiobooks can actually enhance the experience. A good narrator can bring a story to life in a way that a printed page just can't.
That's true. I've listened to some audiobooks where the narrator was so good I was completely engrossed.
And audiobooks are also a great option for people with visual impairments or learning disabilities. So there are definitely some trade-offs, but overall, I think it's a positive trend.
Okay, let's talk about another tech trend that The Economist highlights. And this one's not so great. They dive into this growing frustration with Black Friday sales.
Yeah, Black Friday. It used to be this one day of crazy shopping and deep discounts, but now it's this month-long marketing blitz that's just exhausting.
Totally. And it feels like you need a degree in economics to figure out what's actually a good deal anymore.
I think part of the problem is this constant barrage of advertising leading up to Black Friday. It's overwhelming and it's hard to tell what's a real deal and what's just hype.
And then there's all the confusing pricing and last-minute deals. It's like they're trying to trick you into spending more than you planned.
Yeah, it feels very manipulative, and I think a lot of people are starting to feel burned out by the whole thing.
Okay, let's end on a positive note.
Yeah.
The Economist has this mind-blowing piece about AI that can learn how to cook by watching videos.
That's cool.
I know, right? AI that can cook? Are you serious?
Totally serious. This technology is still in its early stages, but it has huge potential.
So you're telling me that one day I could have a robot chef making me gourmet meals?
It might not be that far off. This AI isn't just following pre-programmed recipes. It's actually learning and adapting like a human chef would. It can recognize ingredients, figure out the steps in a recipe, and even learn how to use different kitchen tools.
That's both amazing and a little bit terrifying. What happens to all the human chefs if robots can do their jobs better and faster?
Well, that's a question that applies to a lot of industries. The rise of AI and automation has the potential to disrupt everything.
It makes you wonder about the future of work. Will we all be replaced by robots?
I think it's important to remember that AI is a tool. It can be used to automate tasks, but it can also be used to augment human capabilities.
So maybe instead of replacing chefs, AI could assist them and free them up to focus on the more creative parts of cooking.
Exactly. And I think we'll see this happen in other industries as well. AI will automate some tasks, but it will also create new opportunities for people to work alongside machines.
Well, it's definitely a brave new world we're heading into. Okay, that's it for part one of our deep dive into The Economist. Welcome back to our deep dive into The Economist. We left off talking about Uruguay and their president who's trying to balance progressive ideals with some tough economic realities.
It's a tough act to pull off.
Yeah, so what are the biggest hurdles they're facing?
Well, The Economist highlights a few key issues that are really putting the pressure on. First, you've got rising inflation, which is eating away at people's purchasing power. Then there's this commitment to poverty reduction, which requires a lot of investment in social programs. And all of that bumps up against the limits of government spending. They can't just spend their way out of trouble without risking further economic instability.
So it's a delicate balancing act for sure. And Uruguay is often held up as this model of stability and progress in Latin America.
Right. Their success or failure could have ripple effects throughout the whole region.
So what's the prognosis? Can Uruguay thread the needle and keep their progressive model while dealing with all these economic challenges?
The Economist lays out a few potential scenarios. One possibility is they find a way to balance things out. Maybe make some targeted cuts to spending, but preserve the core elements of their social safety net. Another possibility is that they're forced to make more drastic cuts, which could lead to social unrest and really undermine their whole agenda. And of course, there's always the risk of a full-blown economic crisis.
Okay, lots to consider there. Let's shift gears back to the U.S. for a second, but this time we're not talking about trade wars or political divides. The Economist has this really intriguing article about Donald Trump potentially stepping in as a peacemaker in the Middle East.
It does sound a bit wild, right?
Yeah, it caught me off guard. But they suggest that this recent ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah could be an opportunity for Trump to get back on the world stage and give diplomacy another shot.
It's interesting because he already tried his hand at Middle East peacemaking with the Abraham Accords.
Right. What makes this situation different?
Well, the Abraham Accords were about normalizing relations between Israel and some Arab countries. This is about mediating between Israel and Hezbollah, which is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, Hezbollah is designated a terrorist organization by many countries, including the U.S.,
Yeah.
and they have a long and complicated history with Israel. So trying to broker a peace deal between them would be incredibly tricky.
Absolutely. It would be fraught with challenges and potential pitfalls.
So what makes the economists think Trump could pull this off?
They point to a few factors. First off, Trump has a history of unconventional diplomacy. He's not afraid to break with tradition and take risks, which could be useful in this situation. Then there's his willingness to engage with adversaries, like we saw with his meetings with Kim Jong-un. And finally, he seems to have a personal connection that could help.
A personal connection. You got to tell me more about this.
The article mentions that Trump has built a close relationship with a Lebanese-American businessman who could potentially act as a back channel to Hezbollah. This individual apparently has ties to both sides of the conflict and could help facilitate communication and build trust.
Wow, talk about back-channel diplomacy. It sounds like something straight out of a spy thriller.
It definitely has all the elements, but it's important to remember that this is all speculation at this point. Whether Trump actually gets involved and whether he'd be successful if he did remains to be seen.
Well, I'll be watching this one closely. Okay, let's move on to something a little less dramatic. The Economist has a roundup of tech trends, and one that caught my eye is the booming popularity of audiobooks.
It's incredible how popular they've become. Everyone seems to be listening to them these days.
I know I've definitely become a convert myself. It's just so convenient. But what's fueling this surge in popularity?
Well, for one thing, you have the rise of subscription services like Audible, which have made it easier and more affordable than ever to access a huge library of audiobooks.
It's like having Netflix for books.
Exactly. And a lot of these services have features that make the listening experience even better. Like, you can adjust the playback speed, set sleep timers, and switch between devices seamlessly.
And let's be honest, our lives are just so hectic these days. It's hard to find time to sit down with a book. But with audiobooks, you can squeeze in some reading time while you're commuting, exercising, or doing chores.
Exactly. It's the perfect solution for our multitasking world. And it's also making literature more accessible to people who maybe don't have the time or the desire to read a traditional book.
Okay, but is something lost when we make that switch from the printed page to the digital voice? Like, is the experience of reading somehow diminished?
This question a lot of people are grappling with. Some argue that you do miss out on some of the nuances of the author's craft when you listen to a book instead of reading it.
Yeah, I get that. There's something special about holding a physical book in your hands, turning the pages, and underlining passages that speak to you.
I agree. But on the other hand, some people say that audiobooks can actually enhance the reading experience. A talented narrator can bring a story to life in a way that a printed page simply can't.
True, I've listened to audiobooks where the narrator was so good, it was like listening to a performance.
Exactly. And audiobooks can also make literature more accessible to people with visual impairments or learning disabilities. So while there might be some trade-offs, I think the rise of audiobooks is a positive development overall.
All right, let's talk about another tech trend that The Economist covers, and this one's not so positive. They talk about the growing frustration surrounding Black Friday sales.
Yeah, Black Friday. It's become this month-long marathon of marketing hype and confusing pricing. It's exhausting.
I totally agree. It feels like you need an advanced degree in economics to figure out if you're actually getting a good deal.
A big part of the problem is this constant barrage of advertising leading up to Black Friday. It's overwhelming, and it's hard to tell what's a genuine discount and what's just clever marketing.
And then there's all the last-minute deals and limited-time offers. They're trying to create this sense of urgency and pressure you into making impulse purchases.
It feels very manipulative, and I think a lot of people are starting to get wise to it.
Okay, let's end on a more upbeat note. The Economist has this amazing piece about AI that can learn how to cook by watching videos.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing stuff.
So you're telling me that one day I could have a robot chef in my kitchen?
It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. This AI isn't just following pre-programmed recipes. It's actually learning and adapting just like a human chef would. It can recognize ingredients, understand the steps in a recipe, and even figure out how to use different kitchen tools.
Wow, that's both incredible and a little intimidating. What happens to all the human chefs if robots can do their jobs better and faster?
It's a question that goes beyond just the culinary world. The rise of AI and automation has the potential to impact countless industries.
It makes you wonder about the future of work. Will we all end up being replaced by robots?
I think it's important to remember that AI is ultimately a tool. It can be used to automate certain tasks, but it can also be used to enhance human capabilities.
So instead of replacing chefs, maybe AI could assist them and free them up to focus on more creative aspects of cooking.
Exactly. And I think we'll see that same pattern play out in other industries as well. AI will automate some tasks, but it will also create new opportunities for people to work alongside machines.
It's a brave new world we're entering. Okay,
Yeah.
one last tech trend before we move on. The Economist has this piece about something called the Clegg effect. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. It's named after Nick Clegg, a British politician who defied expectations and performed much better than anticipated in an election.
So what is this Clegg effect? What happened?
The idea is that people tend to make better decisions when there isn't a clear front runner in a competition. When there's a perceived favorite, we tend to follow the crowd, even if it's not in our best interest. But when the field is more open, we're forced to think for ourselves and weigh the options more carefully.
So in Clegg's case, because he wasn't expected to win, people felt more free to vote for him based on their own assessment of his merits rather than just going with the flow. It's kind of like the underdog effect, but applying to decision-making in general.
Exactly. The Clegg effect suggests that a little bit of uncertainty can actually be a good thing. It forces us to engage our critical thinking skills and make more informed choices.
That's so counterintuitive. I would think that having a clear favorite would make things easier, but it sounds like too much certainty can lead us astray.
I think you're right. We become complacent and stop thinking critically when we think we already know the answer.
So maybe a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of doubt is actually healthy. It
Mhm.
forces us to pay attention, question our assumptions, and make decisions based on our own judgment.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Maybe the Clegg effect is a reminder that we need to cultivate our critical thinking skills and resist the urge to just follow the crowd. We need to be comfortable with uncertainty and make choices based on our own values and beliefs.
That's a great message, and a perfect way to wrap up this segment. Okay, I'm ready to dive into the next batch of insights from The Economist. What's coming up next? Okay, let's keep this deep dive rolling. What else has The Economist got for us?
Well, let's talk about a company that many thought was untouchable, Volkswagen.
Volkswagen, what's going on with them? I always thought of them as this giant of the auto industry.
Oh, they are a giant, but even giants can stumble. They've been hit pretty hard by a bunch of things. Supply chain issues, the global chip shortage that's been hurting everyone in the industry, and the rising cost of materials.
Plus, they're facing all this competition from electric vehicle makers like Tesla.
Exactly, and adapting to that new landscape is really expensive and complicated. The Economist suggests that Volkswagen might have to make some tough decisions, like closing factories, maybe cutting jobs, and really rethinking their whole business model.
It's wild to think about a company as big as Volkswagen having to reinvent itself. It just shows that in this day and age, no company is too big to fail.
Absolutely. Size doesn't guarantee anything. Speaking of companies in trouble, let's talk about Adani Group, the Indian conglomerate.
Oh yeah, that whole saga has been making headlines. Was the latest.
Well, The Economist has this article that digs into all the allegations against them: fraud, stock manipulation, shady dealings. It's a pretty wild story.
So it's a classic case of corporate greed gone wrong. What are the wider implications of all this?
Well, for one thing, it's really shaken up the Indian economy. Adani Group is a huge player there with interests in so many different sectors. And these scandals have raised concerns about corporate governance in India and made investors nervous.
It also shows how important reputation is in the business world. Adani Group built its empire on trust, and now that trust is broken, it's hard to come back from that.
Yeah, rebuilding that trust is going to be a long and difficult process. They'll have to show that they're serious about transparency and ethical behavior, and they can't just talk about it, they have to actually do it.
Okay, let's move on to something a little less intense. The Economist has this interesting piece about something called the Clegg effect. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, it's a fascinating concept from behavioral economics. It's named after Nick Clegg, a British politician who did much better in an election than anyone expected.
So what exactly is this Clegg effect?
The idea is that people tend to make better decisions when there isn't a clear frontrunner in a competition. When we think we know who's going to win, we tend to just follow the crowd, even if it's not the best choice. But when the field is more open, we have to actually think for ourselves and weigh the options more carefully.
So in Clegg's case, because nobody thought he had a chance, people felt more free to vote for him based on his actual merits. It's like the underdog effect, but for decision-making.
Exactly. The Clegg effect suggests that a little bit of uncertainty can actually help us make better choices.
That's so interesting. It seems counterintuitive. But I guess when we're too sure about something, we stop thinking critically.
Right. We become complacent. So maybe a bit of doubt, a bit of chaos is actually a good thing. It forces us to pay attention and make our own judgments.
It's a good reminder that we should always question things and not just blindly follow the crowd.
Absolutely. We need to be comfortable with not knowing everything and be willing to make decisions based on our own values and beliefs.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive. So many interesting stories and insights from The Economist.
It's amazing how much is happening in the world right now.
It really is.
Mhm.
And it's great to have these conversations and try to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. It helps us stay informed and engaged.
So thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into The Economist. We'll be back next week with more insights and analysis. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep an open mind.